Chapter 4. The Shadow of Loss. The morning came gray and heavy over Barrio San Isidro, with clouds pressing down like a weighted blanket. Mang Elias woke to the sound of rain drumming against his nipa roof, not the gentle shower that blessed the rice paddies, but the hard, insistent downpour that would keep him from the fields. He lay still for a moment, listening to the water cascade from the eaves, feeling the dampness seep into his bones and settle in the hollows of his chest. When he tried to rise from his banag, the coughing fit seized him before he could even sit upright. His body convulsed with the force of it, each spasm feeling like it might tear something loose inside him. When it finally passed, he found himself gasping, one hand pressed to his ribs where the pain had lodged itself like a splinter of bamboo. The cloth he pressed to his mouth came away stained, more than the small spots he had been able to ignore for weeks, but evidence he could no longer dismiss. He stared at it for a long moment, feeling something cold settle in his stomach. The truth he had been avoiding pressed against him like the weight of storm clouds overhead. "I'm not dead yet," he thought, but the words felt hollow now, a prayer losing its power against mounting evidence. Through the bamboo walls, he could hear the sounds of the barrio adjusting to the weather, shutters closing against the driving rain, mothers calling children inside, the frustrated lowing of carabaos who knew that indoor days meant restless confinement. The enforced rest should have been welcome, but instead it left him feeling hollow and useless, a burden to himself and others. He had just managed to fold the blood-stained cloth away when footsteps approached his hut, careful, familiar steps that he recognized even through the drumming rain. "Father," Nando's voice called softly, "may I come in?" "Come in, son," Elias replied, quickly settling himself more upright on his banag. Nando ducked through the doorway, shaking droplets from his hair. In his hands was a covered bowl that smelled of ginger and rice porridge, probably sent by Clara, who worried too much about everyone except herself. "You shouldn't have come out in the rain," Elias said gruffly, accepting the warm bowl with hands that trembled slightly. "You'll get sick." "It's all right, Father. We were just worried." Nando settled onto the small stool nearby, his eyes studying his father's face with the careful attention that made Elias want to look away. "Is your cough getting worse?" "It's the same," Elias lied, then immediately felt irritation rise in his chest, not at Nando, but at his own weakness, at the way his son's concern made him feel like a burden. "I'm not dead yet." The words came out sharper than he intended, and he saw Nando flinch slightly. Immediately, regret flooded through him. Here was his younger son, faithful Nando, bringing food and comfort despite the storm, and he was snapping at him like an angry dog. "I know, Father," Nando said quietly, his voice carrying no hurt, only patience. "We just want you to be well." The gentleness in his son's response only made Elias feel worse. When had he become this bitter old man who lashed out at kindness? When had fear made him cruel to the people who loved him most? "Nando," he began, wanting to apologize, to explain, but the words tangled in his throat like fishbones. How could he tell his son that every concerned glance felt like a reminder of time running out? How could he explain that Nando's very presence brought memories of Rosa that still cut like glass after 27 years? "Eat first, Father," Nando said, gesturing to the untouched porridge. "Clara asked if you need anything else. You could also stay with us while it's raining." "No," Elias said quickly. The thought of imposing on his son's small family, of being an invalid in their midst, made his chest tighten with something beyond physical pain. "I'm fine here." They sat in awkward silence for a moment, the rain filling the space between them with steady drumming. Elias could feel Nando watching him, could sense the questions his son wanted to ask but didn't dare voice. The familiar weight of unspoken things settled over them like a blanket. "Father," Nando said finally, his voice careful, if there are things you want to say or things you need." "Nothing," Elias cut him off, the word coming too fast and too harsh. The truth was there were many things, so many things he had never said, never could say. But how did a man tell his son that looking at him brought back the night his mother died? How did he explain that every milestone in Nando's life had been shadowed by Rosa's absence? Nando nodded slowly, resignation familiar in his expression. It was a look Elias had seen too many times, his son accepting another closed door, another silence where words should have been. "All right, father," Nando said, standing up. "I'll come back. Later when the rain stops." After his son left, Elias sat staring at the cooling porridge in his hands, shame burning in his throat worse than any cough. Rosa's death had built a wall between him and Nando that he had never learned to climb over. Every time he looked at his younger son, he saw her face in that final moment, her smile as she held their newborn baby, her whispered blessing before the hemorrhaging began, the way her hand had gone cold in his while Nando wailed with the lusty cry of new life. The midwife had taken the baby away while he held Rosa's lifeless body, and in that moment, grief had wrapped around his heart like barbed wire. Not grief at Nando, never that, but grief at the cruelty of a world where new life could only come at such a price. Grief that had calcified over the years into silence, because how did a man explain to his child that love and loss had become inseparably tangled in his heart? He forced himself to eat Clara's porridge, each spoonful a small act of penance for his earlier harshness. The ginger warmed his throat, and for a moment he allowed himself to remember Rosa's own cooking, her patient hands creating meals from whatever the fields provided. She would have loved Clara, he thought, would have delighted in her grandchildren's laughter. The rain continued its assault on the roof as Elias settled at his small table with the wooden frame that held his embroidery work. The cloth bore the careful stitches of months of secret labor, work that had begun during the previous dry season when the memories of Rosa had grown particularly heavy. His fingers, still steady despite his body's other failures, resumed the delicate pattern they had memorized. Rosa had taught him this skill during their brief marriage, laughing gently at his fumbling attempts. "Hands that know how to hold a plow can also learn to hold a needle," she had said, guiding his fingers through the first awkward stitches. Now, 27 years later, those lessons served his final purpose. Each stitch was a prayer, each carefully placed symbol a word he had never been able to say aloud. A respectful knock interrupted his work. He quickly folded the embroidery and tucked it beneath a stack of old magazines before calling out his welcome. "Mang Elias," came a familiar voice. "This is Ka Lando. May I come in during this bad weather?" The village elder ducked through the doorway, shaking the rain from his weathered salakot. Ka Lando was one of the few men older than Elias in San Isidro, his face mapped with the lines of 70 years spent under the sun. More importantly, he was one of the few people Elias trusted completely, a man whose discretion was as reliable as the mountain that watched over their barrio. "Bad weather for old bones," Ka Lando observed, settling himself on the stool Nando had vacated. "I thought you might want company." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two old men who understood what didn't need to be said. Ka Lando's presence was both blessing and burden. Blessing, because he offered companionship without judgment. Burden because his visit confirmed what Elias had been trying to ignore. People didn't make such calls unless they sensed time growing short. "I saw Nando earlier," Ka Lando said eventually. "The boy is worried. He says there's more blood in your cough." "He notices too much," Elias muttered, though he knew his condition was becoming impossible to hide. Ka Lando studied his friend's face with the frank assessment of someone who had seen many others through their final seasons. "Do you need anything, friend? Are there things you need to set in order?" The question hung between them, loaded with meaning. Elias felt his hand drift unconsciously toward the hidden embroidery, then caught himself. "There is," Elias admitted finally, "something that needs someone reliable to carry out final wishes when the time comes." The elder nodded, understanding without need for further explanation. "When you're ready, I'm here, anytime, day or night." They talked of other things then, memories of seasons past, changes in the village, friends who had already made their journey beyond the fields they had worked. As the rain continued its steady drumming, Elias found himself more at ease than he had been in weeks. "Your sons," Ka Lando said as their conversation wound toward its natural conclusion. "They will inherit more than possessions." "What do you mean?" "I see Nando in the fields tireless without complaint, I also see Ramon at night, searching for stories about you from the elders. Ka Lando's weathered face creased with understanding. Different ways of loving, but both are real. Elias felt something tighten in his throat. Ramon, he doesn't understand responsibility. He's not you, Ka Lando said gently. He's also not Nando, but he's still your son, and I see how you wait for him, like a fisherman's wife waiting for her husband. The observation stung B. Because it was true. Despite everything, Elias did worry about Ramon's wandering ways, did watch for his return with a mixture of hope and fear. It's hard for me, Elias found himself admitting. Words get caught in my throat like fishbones, especially with Nando. Because of Rosa, Ka Lando asked quietly. The name hit Elias like a physical blow. His old friend was one of the few who remembered Rosa clearly, who had seen how her death had changed him. Every time I look at Nando, Elias whispered, the words dragged from some deep place, I remember the night she died, her smile as she held him just once. Then the bleeding. I couldn't show him that seeing him brings back that moment. It's not his fault, but... His voice broke. The pain. I can't show him that I see her in his eyes every day. But it still hurts, Ka Lando finished gently. 27 years, Elias said, his voice breaking. 27 years and I still can't tell him how much I love him because loving him hurts too much. Because every time I try to speak, I see her dying all over again. It was the most he had ever spoken about Rosa's death, about the wound that had never properly healed. Ka Lando simply nodded, his presence a blessing that asked for nothing except honesty. Some things cannot be said, friend, the elder said finally, but they can still be seen, and he will understand in time. When Ka Lando prepared to leave, he paused at the doorway. When you're ready to handle what needs to be done, find me, anytime, day or night. Alone again, Elias returned to his embroidery with new urgency. The conversation with Ka Lando had opened wounds he kept carefully bandaged, but it had also brought a strange kind of relief. Perhaps there were ways to speak love that didn't require words. Perhaps the careful stitches he was placing in white cotton would carry the message his voice had never been able to deliver. The afternoon was fading when another knock came, lighter, more tentative. Father, Ramon is here. Ramon appeared in the doorway looking uncharacteristically subdued, his usual carefree manner dampened by the weather and perhaps by genuine concern. I thought you might be alone on this rainy day, he said, producing a small package wrapped in oiled cloth. I brought tobacco from town. It was better tobacco than the rough local variety Elias usually rolled, a thoughtful gesture that reminded him why he couldn't quite give up hope for his eldest son. Thank you, son, Elias said, accepting the gift with genuine pleasure. Sit down, there's still coffee. They sat together sharing the bitter brew while the rain continued its assault overhead. Ramon seemed content to sit quietly for once, his usual restless energy calmed by the weather and the intimacy of the small space. I heard your cough is bad, Ramon said finally. Nando is worried. I'm not dead yet, Elias said, but without the sharp edge he had directed at Nando earlier. Ramon just nodded calmly. I know, father, but even strong trees need to rest sometimes. The gentle wisdom surprised Elias. When had his wayward son learned to speak with such understanding? They talked about other things, news from the town market, the quality of the tobacco, Ramon's plans for the coming week. It wasn't profound, but it was pleasant in its simplicity. Ramon made no mention of gambling, asked for no money, offered no grand promises. He simply sat with his father and shared the storm-bound afternoon. As Ramon prepared to leave, he paused and looked directly at his father with unusual seriousness. Father, you know that I love you, right? Even though I don't say it often. The words hit Elias with unexpected force. That they came from Ramon, scattered, unreliable Ramon, made them even more precious. I know, Elias managed, his voice thick with more than just illness. I know, son. After Ramon left, Elias sat with his son's words echoing in the storm-darkened hut. Maybe Ka Lando was right. Maybe there were different kinds of love, different ways of showing it. Maybe Ramon's gift wasn't reliability, but these rare moments of simple, uncomplicated affection. As evening fell and the rain finally began to ease, he returned to his embroidery by lamplight. The work was nearly complete, just a few more careful stitches to finish the testament that would have to speak for him when his own voice failed entirely. Each stitch carried the weight of everything he had never been able to say. To Nando, whose patient devotion he had repaid with silence born of grief too deep for words. To Ramon, whose wandering spirit he had tried to anchor with understanding when discipline had failed. Words were fishbones in his throat, but perhaps there were other ways to speak. Perhaps the careful symbols he was placing in white cotton would finally bridge the gap between what he felt and what he could express. Outside, the night sounds of San Isidro resumed as the rain tapered off. The calling of frogs from the flooded paddies, the distant sound of a guitar from someone's porch. It was the sound of life continuing, of the village settling into sleep after the storm. But inside the small nipa hut, an old man continued his careful work by flickering lamplight, stitching together the final pieces of a legacy that would have to speak for him when he no longer could. Each careful loop of thread was a prayer, each precisely placed symbol a word he had never been able to say aloud. The shadow of loss stretched long across the evening, but in the golden circle of lamplight, something else grew, not loss, but completion. The careful transformation of love from feeling to fabric, from heart to hand, from father to sons who would have to find their own way of understanding what he had tried so hard to give them. When he finally set aside his needle and folded the completed work, Mang Elias felt something he hadn't known in months, not peace exactly, but acceptance. Tomorrow, if his strength held, he would complete the final arrangements with Ka Lando. The business of endings could begin. But tonight, listening to the gentle sounds of his village settling into sleep, he allowed himself to rest in the knowledge that he had found a way to speak after all. The embroidered cloth would carry his voice beyond the grave, would finally say what 27 years of silence had kept locked in his heart. Rosa's death had stolen his voice, but perhaps, in the end, it had also taught him another language entirely, one written in thread and time, in sacrifice and patience, in the slow accumulation of love expressed through actions when words failed. He pressed the folded cloth to his chest and closed his eyes, feeling for the first time in decades that he might have found a way to tell his sons what they needed to know. That love didn't always look the way they expected, but it was always there, waiting to be discovered by those who knew how to look.